Yeah.
Ever catch yourself watching a movie,
Yeah.
and there's like a really intense scene, maybe some violence or something, and you just have that fleeting thought like, could this actually happen?
Hmm.
Especially when we think about younger people, like they're still figuring things out, and then they see this stuff. It makes you wonder.
Right.
Well, that's a huge topic in Kerala right now. A lot of people are asking that question.
Yeah.
Like, is there a connection, between what we see in Malayalam cinema with all the grit and the intensity and the fact that we're seeing more violence, more drug use, especially among young people?
It's a really fascinating question. And I think for you, the listener, it really gets at, that fundamental idea. How much do stories influence us? I mean, on the one hand, you have these very real anxieties about what's happening. You see these concerning trends and you want to understand them.
Mm.
And then on the other hand, is blaming movies just too easy? Is it a way to avoid talking about the bigger things that are going on in society?
Yeah, it's kind of like picking the low-hanging fruit, right?
Exactly.
And this whole debate really blew up after Chief Minister Pinarayi Vijayan, he made a statement in the State Assembly, and he actually referenced a police report.
Okay.
And this report suggested that some students, after watching this film, Avesham, I don't know if you've seen it,
I have.
with Fahad Fasil, he's,
So good.
even when he's playing, these kind of more intense, troubled characters.
Right.
But this report said some students were kind of mimicking the characters, those violent characters.
Wow.
It's like they were trying to act that out in their own lives.
It is powerful when a leader like that makes a statement like that, right? And I think for you, the listener, it raises that question, can entertainment really have that much power over us? I mean, are we saying that a couple of hours in a movie theater can somehow override years of family, education, just how we're raised?
Yeah.
I mean, taken to an extreme, it's like the only movies we should watch are biopics of, I don't know, Swami Vivekananda or something. Right. Right?
Right. It does sound a little extreme when you put it like that.
Yeah.
But then again, you hear those concerns, those worries from parents, from educators, and you think, well, is there something to this?
Mm-hmm.
So that's really what we're digging into today. Are these worries valid, or are we missing a bigger, a more complex picture?
Well, let's start with that initial reaction to the chief minister's statement. I mean, it's understandable when you see instances of youth violence, people want to find a cause, right? And cinema, it's such a big part of our culture, it's an easy target. But as Dr. C.J. John, he's a senior psychiatrist in Kochi,
Okay.
he pointed out that it's rarely that simple.
Right. He brought in that really important perspective that, yes, there is research out there that suggests that watching a lot of violence can lower inhibitions towards aggression in some people.
Right.
But he also said, we can't just look at films in isolation.
Of course not.
We've got to think about things like substance abuse, the kind of social environment these kids are growing up in,
Yeah.
and, maybe most importantly, parenting.
The family support.
Yeah, like what's happening at home? Are they getting the guidance they need?
Absolutely. And I think that's such a crucial point for you, the listener, because it's one thing for a young person to see a violent character on screen. But if they're not getting that moral compass at home, if they're not learning to separate fiction from reality, the consequences can be quite different.
Yeah.
It's like Dr. John said, if a kid watches a movie where, I don't know, someone's acting like a gangster, and then they start acting that way, is it the movie's fault, or is it the lack of, parental guidance that's really the issue?
It's easy to point the finger.
Right.
It's easy to just say, oh, it's the movie.
What was those violent films?
But then you talk to someone like film critic G.P. Ramachandran, and he brings up a really interesting point. He says that this whole love of violent stories, it's not just a Malayalam cinema thing.
Yeah.
It's everywhere.
It's a global thing.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the success of RRR, KGF, Pathan. You've got Hollywood films like The Kill. These are all packed with action, and they're huge all over the world. And Ramachandran's point, and it's a good one for you to consider, if just watching violence on screen automatically made people violent, wouldn't we be seeing a completely different world right now?
Yeah, Hollywood's been making action movies for, 100 years?
At least.
So there's clearly more to it, right?
There's got to be.
It's not just cause and effect.
Right.
And then there's this other layer that psychologist Abhirami E. brought up. She's noticed this shift from what used to be just friendship groups to something she calls friendship gangs.
Interesting.
Now she's not talking about, organized crime or anything like that.
Right.
But it's more about, how these groups interact, how they behave.
The dynamics.
Yeah, like there's this acceptance, maybe even a glorification of being aggressive.
Okay.
And her point about desensitization, I think, is so important here for you, the listener. It's the idea that the more we see violence, the less we react to it.
We become numb to the
Yeah, like
thing.
the first time you see something brutal, you're like, oh my God, that's horrifying.
Right.
But then after you've seen it over and over, it's just like, he only got stabbed 3 times, whatever.
Exactly. And I think for you, that normalization, that's what's really worrying.
Absolutely. But it's not just films.
No, of course not.
I mean, we see violence on the news, online. It's everywhere.
It's pervasive.
So again, it's too easy to just blame the movies.
Exactly. It's like blaming, I don't know, the gym for someone's physique, you know?
Right.
You're ignoring all the other factors, the diet, the exercise, the dedication.
Yeah, it's the whole picture.
Yeah.
And then you've got the case of Marco, this film that actually got banned by the censor board.
Wow.
And the content, it was pretty extreme. We're talking about cutting off body parts, killing children, even a pregnant woman being murdered during childbirth.
That's really disturbing.
Incredibly disturbing. And apparently even the producer himself, Sharif Mohammed, he said after this that he wouldn't make violent films anymore.
Interesting.
So it makes you think, where's the line?
Yeah.
How much violence is too much?
How much is okay to show, to entertain with? And, you know, I think this case also highlights Dr. John's point about the censor board needing to really scrutinize even the UA-rated films. Because they could be promoting harmful behavior without even meaning to.
It's a tough one, isn't it?
It is, and it kind of makes you wonder, if people were really so influenced by movies, why aren't we seeing everyone who watched, you know, Swades going out and dedicating their lives to rural development?
Right. That's a good point.
It's not a one-to-one thing.
No, definitely not. So obviously the film industry has something to say about all this.
Of course.
The Kerala Film Producers Association, they made a good point about the fact that violent content isn't just in movies, it's in video games. It's on streaming services, you know, those OTT platforms.
Right.
And even in the news, every day we see terrible things happening on the news.
Absolutely.
And then FEFCA, the Film Employees Federation of Kerala, they added that cinema often reflects human struggles, you know, the challenges we face.
Our resilience.
Yeah, exactly. And they asked, if we blame movies for every crime, where do we stop?
Yeah.
I mean, do we censor all art that shows any kind of violence or conflict?
Good point. And they also brought up, you know, cases in the past where crimes were linked to specific films and Job Pathira, Drishyam.
Yeah.
But those connections, they're usually more about the methods, not the motivations for the crime, right?
Right.
It's not like watching the movie made them do it.
No.
And I always think about that example of Kung Fu Panda.
Right.
It kind of makes the whole thing seem a little absurd.
It does. It really
Yeah.
does. So maybe, just maybe, we're focusing on the wrong thing here.
What do you mean?
Well, filmmaker Don Palathora, he has a really interesting take on this. He says that blaming movies, it's almost like a way for us to avoid talking about the bigger issues.
Okay.
The things that are really wrong in society.
Yeah, like what kinds of things?
Things like inequality, the frustrations that a lot of young people are feeling,
Right.
the lack of support systems.
That feeling of being lost or unheard.
Exactly. He's saying that cinema is basically a mirror. It's reflecting what's already there.
So we're blaming the mirror instead of looking at what it's reflecting.
Exactly. And to just get rid of the movies, it's like putting a Band-Aid on a wound that needs stitches.
Right.
You're not treating the real problem.
You're just covering it up.
And Palathora's point is that no movie, no matter how violent, can make someone commit a crime if they're not already predisposed to it or if they're not going through something really difficult.
That makes sense.
So is Malayalam cinema really the bad guy here?
Right.
Or is it a scapegoat?
It's the big question, isn't it? And, you know, I think for you, the listener, it's important to remember that media has an influence, but it's just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, and if we're really worried about young people mimicking gangsters, maybe we should ask ourselves why they're drawn to that lifestyle in the first place.
Right. What need is it fulfilling?
What's missing in their lives?
Exactly.
Because until we figure that out and start addressing those root causes, you know, the poverty, the lack of opportunities, we're just going to keep having the same debate over and over again.
And as you said, banning a film isn't really a solution in this day and age.
Not at all. People will find a way to watch it if they want to.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that there are no easy answers here.
It's complicated.
Very complicated, but it's something we need to keep talking about.
Absolutely.
And I'll leave you with this thought for you, the listener.
Okay.
If the stories we tell, especially the ones that are really popular, reflect our society, what does the popularity of violent films, not just in Malayalam cinema, but globally, what does that tell us about the world we live in? Are these films just a mirror?
Are they showing us something we don't want to see?
And if they are, what does that mean for us?
Yeah,
Something to think about.
it really is.
So the next time you're watching a film, especially one that deals with tough topics, maybe ask yourself, what's this film really saying? Not just about the characters, but about us.
About the world we've created.
Exactly. Thanks for diving deep with us.
Thanks for listening.